Okay, the next item on our agenda is the monthly budget report. I'm sorry, the PMA presentation.
The board had asked for Howard Kraus, the representative from PMA that was working with RB in the fall and throughout the year, to come in and give an updated report. So Howard's here tonight to provide us an updated report on our financial projections, and I stress the word projections. And Howard will touch on this in a little bit. During his presentation, he uses estimates and round numbers, where in some of the projections that myself and Mr. McGinnis have been providing to the board have been off of people's exact salaries that were cut or exact stipends, dollar amounts for stipends and benefits and some of those things. So Mr. Kraus will be presenting for us tonight. And then I know there were some questions from a board member, so we can say he'll work those into his presentation, and we'll have an opportunity at the end to ask additional questions as well. Okay?
Once you have a seat, sit down, relax.
Okay.
Do you need your clicker for the Mary Ann?
Mary Ann's going to be my clicker tonight.
Okay.
And please don't worry about attending me if you want to leave. So I'm used to it. I can clear out a room pretty well. Thank you. Since I was here in November, there's a lot of information that has changed, updated. Your plans for next year are much clearer at this time than what we knew back in November. So what we wanted to do this evening is to bring you an update between Tim and myself, with Kevin's assistance, to clarify any information that where there's some variation, as Kevin said, as we're using a projection model as opposed to actuals, and to report back that given the changes that are in place for FY13, the picture is much better than what it was back in November, and it's moving in the direction, as you will see, that was certainly the direction given to the administration earlier in the year. So on the next slide, if we could. This is simply the picture of the revenues by source. What I did in the presentation that you have in front of you, and as will be on the screen, is highlight those things that are significant that have changed in a dark blue, so we can isolate those options for you to understand the impact of those.
Howie, wait a minute, let's get that all together.
Just double click on this.
Good.
And for the audience, and just as a refresher, Riverside Brookfield High School District is paid for almost entirely by local sources. 87% of your revenues coming from local property taxes, and another 5.4% coming from other local sources, including fees and building rentals and so forth. And if we were to project that towards next year, you would see those increase, those percentages. Largely because, as you'll see, we're projecting that state revenues will be down, and there were a small amount of new property taxes plus increase in fees that will increase those percentages of local sources. On the next one, please. Again, as we talked in blue, the dark blue, when we were here earlier in November, of course, we didn't know what the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, would be that you will use for your levy process next December. That came out in January at 3%, so that you have access to 3% additional money from local properties, plus what you would receive from new construction. I think we were using 2% or 2.5% in our projections last November. And that 1% increase is about $175,000 of additional revenue. So somewhere between $90,000 and $175,000 of additional revenue for next year over what we projected earlier. We are still using the existing EAV pattern that has been typical of the district and this portion of Cook County. We're still using a 2.5% the tax collection rate of 99%. Question was raised in November about what impact refunds for the Property Tax Appeals Board would have. And so what we've done is, looking at the last 5 years or so, 4 or 5 years, those averaged about 2% a year. There's some significant differences, some of them higher, some of them lower. But what we did to capture that refund was effectively reduce the property tax collection rate to 97% to offset those refunds. Hopefully then the collection rate at 99% and fewer refunds would equate to larger dollars coming in. And then the board has approved increased local fees for pupil activities, other local revenues of approximately $108,000 in FY13. General state aid. We had projected and still look at some increases in we projected an increase in 13, and we're going to come back to that, but then decrease based on your average daily attendance estimates. Right now, we are using an 8% reduction in the monies that you would be typically allotted by the state to reflect what is currently one of the plans on the table in Springfield for reducing monies going to the State Board of Education in Illinois. The 8% today, the state Senate passed its legislation with allocations, and actually that would equate to about that 8%. We're waiting for the House to put into legislation that numbers that equate to what they previously passed in a resolution, which could reduce general state aid down to as little as 85% of what you would be due. Luckily, because you're not as heavily dependent on general state aid, that's not a large amount of money, but when you're getting closer and closer to that balanced budget target, we're moving a little bit further away the more Springfield is in session. And we did reduce the amount of general state aid projected in future years to reflect what looks to be now an ongoing, less optimistic view of state finances out through 17. Any questions on that? Anything so far? Please.
For the tax revenue we get, what happens when homeowners default on their loans or they just walk away from the homes?
Typically what we're seeing is that the mortgage holder is making those payments to maintain control of the property. We have not, with the exception of some of our very poor districts in South Cook, we're not seeing property collection rates change very much so far. That's good news. I think we all assume that given the foreclosures or people walking away that we would see either more delayed payments or more defaults, but we don't have any evidence of that from our district so far.
Is 99% of that a realistic tax collection rate based on the report we're going to hear later?
No.
Done this year.
No, I think, but he touched on that he's putting 99, but taking off the 2% to come back to the 97 that Tim will report out, to be a little consistent to your 97, correct, Tim?
Well, he's netting out the refunds
Yeah.
to get to the 97.
Which he's estimating those are
And
going
you're,
to happen.
and you're saying
Some-
that you're at 97 before the refunds?
Before the refunds. And part of the reason, that, and primarily in the bond and interest fund, is that the budget numbers are higher than probably what should have been budgeted.
So should we?
This year.
Coming in this year, yeah.
So should it be 97 and 2 for our projection?
Well, I think what Howie's saying is that what Derek's seeing is that districts are receiving about 99% of what their levies are. And so the numbers that he uses are coming out of the tax levy information that we gave to him. It's not
But-
coming out of the
But
budget.
aren't we also talking about the operating funds, not in here is also the debt service?
Yes,
Okay.
typically. The county does add a loss and cost number, I would assume of a percent or more.
They add 5% for bond and interest, But they don't add anything here for any of the other funds. And we may look at trying to change that with the county to. plug in a
The
number
question
there.
is stemming from when Tim has reported, he's projecting about a 97% tax collection rate. So you have a 99, I think we need to clarify or adjust. So I think that's where the
Sure.
question's stemming from.
So what you're saying is if we budget properly, we should be able to
We should be coming in
shoot for a
at the
99%
right.
collection.
Right.
Okay.
But then you gotta take the refunds out.
Well, yeah.
And is our percentage on refunds, at that 2%, is that a good number? Is that a low number, high number?
It's a good average number. I mean, one year we had it much higher than that, but there are years that have been lower than that. So in terms of a projection like this, it's, you know, it's like anything else. You're just trying to find a middle ground to project.
Okay.
Okay. All right, on the next 2 pages, but I'll just focus, if you would, Mary Ann, on this one, please. This is then the revised general state aid projection, given those changes that we made, prorating next year's general state aid by 8% reduction, and then an additional 5% reduction, and then holding the foundation level flat. You see that we're down, I think it's approximately, we're down from 709 to 652, 709,000 originally projected for next year to 652,000.
739.
739. Let me put these on. Yes.
So I have, the revised is 739, then state revenue has got the 739 to 709. So which one are we?
We're going from 739, I'm sorry, 709, correct, in 2013, and instead at 652, 652,000.
Okay.
So approximately $61,000.
But this, in your note on general state aid, you said you were gonna reduce 5%, 8%, then 5, and then flat, right?
Correct.
It looks like we're, I don't know, I'm sure it's around 8% to 2013, but 2014 and 15 are flat, and 16 is showing an increase.
14, I'm seeing us going from a projected 686,000 down to 652,
So you
and then
need
from
to,
681 to 645.
Are you asking us to compare the 2 graphs?
That's correct, yes. The revised one on top is the current projections versus the ones that we had in November.
okay, so 2013 you had 709, now we're going to 652. 2014 you had 686, now we're going to 652.
Right.
2015, 681 to 645. So that's the decrease you're showing?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, will any of this change, which is probably it, with them talking about throwing pensions back to the school districts, will they throw any coffers to us, or will they just, what are you doing right now?
Okay, so I expect, we were at the School Business Officials Conference last week. Roger Eddy, who is becoming the Executive Director of the School Board Association after leaving the legislature in mid-March, reported, as did the Executive Director. It appears, and given the progress today in Springfield, I still think that the legislature will complete its work by May 31st. We will have a budget in place, and there will be pension reform. The budget will change the general state aid. There is still a lot of conversation about what will happen with transportation and how that may be reduced, potentially significantly for regular ed transportation reimbursement. Whether that shifts over to support the general state aid claims or not is still very much up in the air. On the pension side, the Management Alliance people met with the leaders, the Speaker and the Senate President and the Governor and the Governor's Budget Director last Friday and then again yesterday to talk about how the pension reform is evolving. The best guess they had, or what was being talked about on Friday, was that the state would shift about 7.5% of its payments for the TRS back to the local school districts. That would be phased in at the rate of 1% a year. With the first year, the state giving the districts, for FY13, the state giving the districts a grant to cover that amount. So, now this is still very speculative and certainly evolving, and there has been no word out of all of the conversations that occurred yesterday as a result of conversations over the weekend. So, this is extremely fluid. But for example, then, if you're, Tim, can you help me with what your salary costs are for TRS approximately?
The certified salaries, we have $600,000.
Close to 8?
8 million?
8 million, yeah.
Okay, let's just use 8 million as a number. So what that would mean is that somewhere between $560,000 and $650,000 of additional cost would be placed on the district. Ideally, it would be phased in, and that would be annual cost to support the teacher's retirement system, which is truly a benefit to your staff. It is not a benefit to the district, it is a benefit to your staff that the state is now saying, we're not going to pay that benefit, you're going to pay that benefit. If that were to occur in 1% increments of, let's just say that it's $80,000 a year, if you were now next year to have to pay an additional $80,000, the state would give you $80,000 to give them back.
Where would that money come from?
I suspect it will come from CPPRT, the Corporate Personal Property Replacement Tax.
Which is money we were supposed to get anyway.
Which we're already getting.
Right.
Yeah.
The speaker last week, or the week before, threw out the sweep of those funds to help offset the pension. I think that's the direction it's going to go. So $80,000 of additional cost in FY13, but the following year, and $80,000 of revenue, but the following year would be up to $160,000 with no money to support it. So the real impact could start to hit you in FY14 and then grow at that $80,000 a year until it reaches some actuarially established equilibrium with what the state what has to be paid for current obligations while the state takes on and retains the responsibility for past obligations.
So you started off by saying we would pay 7.5% of what the state has to pay, but that's not what you meant. Because 7.5%, the state, what's the state match, 10% or something?
Right now, the state, the state's obligation, in big terms, is $800 million for current.
What's the match?
Our number was 2.6 million last year.
What percentage does the state
7.65?
put in?
7.65% of your certified payroll.
So they're gonna shift the whole 7.65 to the local school
Yeah,
boards
eventually.
overtime.
If they would shift that 7.65, yes, that's kind of the number that's being talked about. In effect, though, they are also having to pay still the unfunded liabilities that they've had in the past. And that equates to, when you use federal dollars to pay for a certified staff member, this year I think we had to pay about 25% of the salary to TRS, which effectively was at 7.65%, and the unfunded past liability, which I would equate that to about another 17%.
We don't use any federal dollars, though, do we, for salaries?
We do for one teacher for our Title I grant, yes.
And that's built into the money we get, though?
Yes.
Otherwise, we try to fund everything through our local sources.
So let me, again, because it sounds like, oh, it'll come from Springfield, what you said, but the state's not shifting 7.65% of their liability. They're shifting all the current liability. Their plan now is to shift the whole current liability onto the school board over a period of time.
I agree with the latter part. I think that is the 7.65%, their current liability, just for the people working
I agree with
next
that.
year. Okay.
But it's not, if they were paying them $10 million, for our district, $1 million a year, and they were shifting 7.65%, the shift would be $76,500. They are they pay, using that example, 7.65%, which equals $1 million, and they plan to shift the whole 7.65 and the whole $1 million onto the local school district, from what you're saying now.
I'm not sure we're saying exactly the same thing, but, and at this point, we have to wait for the legislation to come down.
Now, Howie, would that number ever grow because of more pressure that they would have on it, or growth of the pension?
What they're trying to do is establish, based on the salaries to be paid next year, what's actuarially calculated to be that obligation, and shift that obligation to the local districts. And as your salaries at the local district grow or shrink, that would drive that number. The percentage wouldn't end up changing, just how much you would pay based on what you do with salaries.
Okay.
Well, if you do it on an actuarial basis, it's not just whether the salaries grow or shrink, it also depends upon how the investments go in that. If you had a bad period like we did in a recession and you had to fully fund that part, you would have to make pretty significant payments based on an actuarial basis instead of just a percentage, right?
I would agree.
Okay.
Yes.
So is that money in addition to the 8% you talked about on the previous slide?
As an additional obligation of the district, yes.
So that'll be a 15% then additional cost to the district?
I don't think you'll get it all at once. If they phase it in at 1% a year of the 7%, let's say it's 7%, then it would take 7 years to phase it in at 1% a year additional. That would be your obligation.
So Laura, what you're trying to say is that the current revenue stream that the district has been getting from the state is going down at the same time they're putting an expense burden on the district.
Right.
So is that a wash?
No.
No, it's
Double negative.
Double negative.
Wish it was.
Okay.
Less
All right,
money
I'm
coming
sorry.
in and we have an increase in bills.
Less money coming in and less and
So
more
that
money
would-
going out.
Yeah, so that would mean if you talked about an estimated 8% increase obligation of the school has an 8% increase, right?
Increase in,
Increase
Decrease
in
in
our
revenue.
obligation or decrease in revenue, and then we have to pick up a percent. We would start out at a little over 8, and then the next year 9, 10, until we,
Correct, it's 15,
That's what
20
he was
something,
saying,
yeah.
it's phased. Call it an
It's a little confusing
The one-
because the 8% proration on the general state aid and the 8% increase in the TRS obligation sound like the same 8%. They're not two different bases, but yeah, either way you look at it, every district in Illinois is going to get less general state aid money than they should have gotten and have an increased obligation to pay for the retirement function.
To be respectful of the presentation and our time, would it be safe to say, Howie, not built into this, but we need to be prepared for not only are the deficits that we're currently dealing with in our fund balances, but there could be additional expenditures added on to that deficit that we need to be prepared for.
Absolutely. There's nothing good going to happen for you in Springfield.
Okay. All right.
The next slide, 2 slides up, one more please, is just your operating budget for this year and broken out by percentages, salaries and benefits being the largest portion. And then the next slide, the key expenditure assumptions. There were some changes made to our projections that are decreasing your projected expenditures, particularly on salary and benefits. There were 3 additional retirees who were planned to go out in FY13 that are accelerated and going out in FY12. Replaced then by less expensive, or would have been replaced by less expensive people. However, there's also an additional 8 certified staff, 2 classified staff reductions, plus some reduced administrative salaries that are included in the new projections. When my calculations, as Kevin alluded to earlier, we're using rough numbers as opposed to specific numbers, averages on our part, as opposed to specific numbers on Tim's part. From our projections, that look like about $750,000 of salary and a reduction of $181,000 of benefits. In addition to that, health benefits, health insurance costs had a lesser increase for next year than we were projecting back in November by about 3%, I believe, and that's another $80,000 of savings. So when we look then to the next 2 pages, the revised staffing, again, looking at the second one is the staffing projections was from November, the revised staffing projections from now. We had originally projected going down by 2 staff members in November for next year. Now we are down a total of 10 to 85.3, and using that as the base going forward. That's reflected in those savings that we just talked about. So on the next 2 pages,
Can I ask
Please.
you a question? What do you base the tuition increase of 10% on?
that was the expectation of what tuition costs would be for your out-of-district special ed students.
Oh, 10% increase.
Right. And I don't believe that's been established quite yet, but that has historically been one of the fastest rising costs to districts is your out-of-district placement.
Well, I won't get into why it happens, but just accept it, 10%, that's the high.
We'll touch on staffing, as we have the revised staffing projections up here. We'll touch on this a little later when we talk about the budget update and some other things, but right now it's a 10.2 reduction, and more or less, remember, we have to keep in mind transfers and some things I'll talk to you about later, so we should be more around 86.3. Because we'll probably have to add back close to about 1.0 FTE when we start building in our transfers and some of those things.
Okay.
Okay. So then, Mary Ann, if you would skip ahead to the revised aggregate projection, 2 more. There we go. So this page now is the current view from our model of where you are. And I think as we had conversation among us in preparation for tonight, the number of $420,000 deficit projected in our model for FY13 appears to be overstated. And Kevin can go back to specifically where having specific numbers for specific people compared to mine looking at what we're taking off as an average cost for that new teacher or that teacher being reduced, probably brings that down closer to the $100,000 to $200,000 range as it sits right now. So again, projections, some modeling that will only be cleared up, and as Tim gets closer to presenting an actual budget, that's when that number will be clarified. But you can see, whether on these 2 pages or on the next 2 pages, that your longer-term picture is much better with those reductions being made, even with the potential reductions on the general state aid. It will get worse if the pension stuff comes in. However, if we look 2 slides further, please.
Questions about this?
Oh, sure.
Kevin, asked why don't the budget numbers match the budget that we approved?
Yeah, it was one of the questions I emailed you that was sent from a board member, Tim.
Well, the beginning fund balance and the projected year-end fund balance that Howie uses is coming off of the AFR, which includes all of the accruals. The numbers that you approve in the budget are the cash, there's no accruals in there, so that's the cash basis fund balances that we expect. So that would be the difference in those.
Well, which do we use when we set a policy to say we were gonna keep a 20% reserve? And we thought in our budget we were at 2335 this year. Were we at 2335 or were we at 2577? Were we doing it on
We were-
a cash
we were-
basis or on an accrual basis?
Well, we were at 23 because we were doing it on the cash basis. The cash number is lower than these numbers here.
Well, my concern is our goal, only financial goal we have is reserves, which is based on a cash basis, but we're showing this on an accrual basis, which appears to show that our reserve is higher than what we are looking for versus our policy.
Well, the percentage is higher because the number is different. The fund balance number is different if you're looking at the accrual numbers out of the audit than if you're looking at the cash basis numbers that we present in the budget on the financials.
And I understand.
So I think a more realistic number for us to look at is the cash basis. That's the money in the bank. You know, and I think that certainly is more important than a number that an auditor puts together at the end of the year.
So I think we should be consistent with what we think we do for our policy, because these numbers are higher than what we're looking at under our policy.
But our policy states, doesn't it, it's a minimum of 20%.
Right.
So if it's above 20, as long as it's 20% and above, that's, would still be within the policy guidelines, right?
Yes, but the problem is, we're at 2335, that was our budget. This shows 2577, which is almost 2.5% more. That's a starting point. So I can't tell, but if I assume it stays all along, in 2014, we're going to drop below 20% on a cash basis, which is what we measure ourselves on. So if we're going to use these for projections to see if we can achieve our goals, it seems like we should do it on the same basis that you're reporting and that our policy is based on.
So can we change these numbers and plug in the cash numbers?
Sure.
Instead?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The second question I have is, what assumptions did we use to project, for instance, maybe it said it in there, it said it, I missed it, but since the salaries and benefits are our biggest cost, how did we project those for 2014? How did we project what they would be?
We put in a placeholder
Okay.
that reflected current thinking of what that might be, and I don't remember offhand what those were. I apologize.
Kevin, can you tell us?
2%, I thought we used for 14, 15, CPI 2%, I thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
So next to 13 was the 6.5% to 7% that the average teacher salary increase will be, and then after that, we were using, I thought, 2% CPI
Okay, thank you.
in the revised.
Any other questions? Okay.
Okay, so to your comments then on where the projected ending fund balances are in your operating funds looking forward, what we really are taking the FY11 ending fund balances as audited, so those would certainly be accrued. But at that point, we're using cash moving forward based on projected budgets. So I think that to your comment that if we're changing it up or down at the beginning, that would be relatively consistent moving forward.
Thank you.
And then trying then on the next set of, with the 20% fund balance target line, that line would shift based on FY11 ending fund balances, but remain relatively consistent to the...
The curve will stay the same, we'll just start on.
I believe so, yes. What that would show is that you're extending a little bit longer before you get down into being below your fund balance, because you've made significant changes in your expenditure items over the next few years.
So Howie, on the current graph you have up there, the bar graph towards the end, is the yellow, and which says 2012.
If we could go up, please, two more. This one, Kevin? Or the bigger one?
I was looking at the first one, but we could use this one. Is this
This
easier?
is just those current and 5-year projected with the new numbers. So. I'm
So the
sorry.
green line is 20%, is the 20%?
Yes,
So after 2014, we'll be below 20%.
that's correct. And you're very, very close in 14. But
If we do-
certainly looking at 15 and beyond, I would say you'd be,
But if we do it on a cash basis, we might drop down.
Fast.
below.
that's quite possible.
And that, this does not, right now, this does not take into account the possibility of additional pension expenditures.
Right.
Correct?
That's correct.
What are you recommending to your districts when you talk to them about this? Still put the 80,000 aside so you don't get double hit in the next year, or what do you do?
I think you have to, if we know that it's going to be 1% a year, at least it's somewhat predictable of how much you have to absorb. I think that one of the attorneys that we've had speak to our groups about negotiations, his emphasis that if the district is being told that they have to absorb this teacher retirement system obligation, it is a benefit for the teachers, not any benefit for the district, and that has to factor into negotiations. But ultimately, you're not going to have any choice. And I'm not sure we're going to know for several years whether it's going to be closer to 5% or closer to 8% that you have to absorb. Some of that is predictive based on how many teachers will opt into other alternatives on health insurance and so forth.
Okay,
It's
so
all wrapped together.
taking a look at this in 2013, 2014, just how this is in place. I mean, what this kind of shows the board is based on the reductions we made, you know, next year and into the year after that, we can try to remain status quo, and that's not counting on any kind of pension expenditure being added on. The other thing that I want to bring to your attention, and Tim McGinnis, correct me if I'm wrong here, and Howie, but when we started, and Gary, you were there, and we worked on this a little bit, when we adjusted those projections for 14, 15, 16, 17, we tried to use like a CPI number, because there was a lot of talk of, well, we'll be bargaining a new contract. Even with a CPI number for salary or expenditures, it's still going to be driving us down below 20%. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
If you assume the 242 difference between the reserve on an accrual basis and a cash basis, which is what's in here, carries forward, which is what you're suggesting, we would be at about 19 and a half at the end of 2014, and
Right.
20 without any of these other losses that we haven't even put in here.
Right.
And every,
Now, the thing that could change too is as you get some other, if other people leave, resignations and different staff come in at a different salary. I mean, so there could be some fluctuation of possibly a little more additional revenue with the cell tower and some more rentals. But I mean, basically what this will show is after 2014, we'll be, cash or accrual, we'll be on that point with our policy that will be below 20%, maybe even before that.
I think it's showing, based on what you're telling us, that at 2014, in 2014, we'd be below a 20% reserve. I mean, you can't assume, based on the assumptions you're making.
Okay, any other questions? Okay.
The last 2 pages are simply looking at financial profile score, which do not take into account specifically the 20%, but rather at least saying that you're maintaining a higher ranking a little bit longer before you fall into that.
What is the financial profile score for like a Proviso Morton versus LT?
Proviso is undoubtedly in the warning, the red category, because they already have an oversight panel in place. Morton is surprisingly not yet under one. I think they've done some things to try to change that, to try to avoid that, but they certainly would be closer to provisos than yours. LaGrange would not be anywhere close to that. They'd be, undoubtedly, they'd be in one of the two highest categories.
Any other questions for Howie?
What's the observations by Howie?
I think we've touched on most of those, but the district has taken the bull by the horns, if you will, with the forced reductions in staff for next year, trying to make itself more efficient and reduces expenditures. Those have the most significant impact on the financial projections of anything we're talking about. And we're still going to know, I think, in the next couple of weeks, how badly the state will impact the district over not just next year, but the longer term impact is that TRS obligation. Certainly a bigger number and forever, as opposed to somewhere along the line hoping that we'll recover on the general state aid side.
Will there be any federal money coming in because of this?
No, in fact, there's a question on some of the federal dollars already not having sufficient monies. We got word this last week about some of the extraordinary special ed expense money that typically comes from the feds, not having enough money to fund those. But if the big worry is that if the Congress is not able to come to agreement on the enforced reductions in the budget for FY13, then there are some automatic reductions. I don't remember the name that they're using for that, but basically automatic cutting back of domestic and other funds, and that undoubtedly will cause fewer federal dollars to come to every district for some of the discretionary programs.
Okay. Any other questions for Howie? Thank you again, very, very good. Appreciate it.
Howard was part of the recommendations for the board on the financials. We'll talk about this a little later, but we wanted to make sure we started to sequence out some things as the board prepared for collective bargaining, as well as the prospecting of revenue enhancements for the future. So we have Howard here today, and then after that we will, in August, we'll bring in William Blair on bond counsel, and we'll start talking about bonds, and then we can discuss how you want to go on anything further. So if you think you have a question for Howard, now would be the time in regards to projection wise.
Any questions? Thank you.
Good job, Howard.
Thank you.